So imagine you're the president of Brazil, and you have 4 ministers who've come before you and said, we want to talk about this project, this Belo Monte project. And the first one is the Minister of Economy. Kind of the foresun's been in a different kind of direction. The Minister of Economy said we need electricity to grow. We have a growing middle class, and they have more of a demand for electricity. And we have industries that are hiring people. We need this dam to grow. And the Minister of Finance said, we need this dam because it's a low cost of energy. Our companies can compete on the global markets, and we don't want to rely upon expensive and dirty imported oil. Minister of the Environment said, you know, I'm a little concerned about flooding Amazon territory, so I'm sort of ambivalent, but I'm going to have a passive vote against this project. And the Minister of Indigenous People said, I'm entirely against this project. How could you think about displacing 20,000 people? That's not what we stand for. And then you're the president and you said, well, I'm going to take a 15-minute break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about this and I'm going to give you my answer. In other words, it's a complicated issue in terms of balancing the various constituencies and the various needs. And that's what makes this topic all the more interesting when you look at it from a multi-dimensional framework. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to engage the audience as quickly as possible, because you've all been very, very good sitting there. But I thought that maybe one way to start off the conversation would be, as we're thinking about these various considerations, we're talking about Brazil. But I'd be curious as well if anybody wants to speak before we open it up. There's a number of people in the United States and around the world who have said that the Amazon is such a precious resource that it's really not up to Brazil to control its destiny, that it's really a world resource. And so let's make it even more complicated. We've got our 4 ministers who have made their supplication to the president, but while we've been on break, the president of Brazil has been receiving phone calls from the head of the European Union and from the president of the United States saying, don't you understand how important the Amazon is to the global economy? And Tom Friedman even called up, Tom Friedman Brandeis, and he said, I've been telling the students at Brandeis that they really want to make a difference in the world. Forget about just recycling these plastic bottles. They need to have some sort of protest saying, save the Amazon. And so what do I do when Tom Friedman's about to write an article in the New York Times? So how do you not only balance, if you will, the various different constituencies of Brazil, but world opinion? And does the world have a right to opine? So I'm just going to open it up to the panelists, and in terms of the wise counsel, now the president of Brazil has retreated to her room. You're the trusted advisor. Give her some help. Who wants to start? Okay.
I'll give it a shot.
And then we'll get some wise advice, and we'll open it up to the students in the audience.
Let me give it a shot. This is a difficult one. But Dr. Espinosa mentioned the intergenerational issues associated with climate change, right? And the intergenerational issues associated with climate change and the environment and so on and so forth. There's a paper, a whole set of discussions by Thomas Schelling, who was the 1995 Nobel Prize in Economics, where he discusses precisely this issue. And this is the analogy that I wanted to mention. Right, postponing consumption today for the benefit of our descendants and so on and so forth. But he makes a very interesting point. He said, when we postpone consumption today, who exactly is going to benefit from it in the future? Are the Americans who are not going to consume today who are going to benefit? Or are the Indians? Or are the Chinese? Now, if you have this type of concern about who in the future is going to enjoy or to benefit from our savings today, why don't we have the same type of consideration for intragenerational problems? Why don't we make the transfers from the US, Germany, and the UK today? Why do we have to expect 100 years, 150 years to do that, right? So from the point of view of intergenerational issues, right, we think that yes, we do have to maintain, I mean, the whole concept of sustainable development is to allow people in the future to continue to enjoy, however you define the benefits that nature and society can provide to us, but why don't we have the same type of consideration with our contemporaries? And if you do that, right, the question becomes a lot more complicated. And one way of dealing with that is saying, well, we are organized in sovereign states. We can discuss if Brazil consists of more than one nationality or not, right? But then the transfer should be paid now, and they should be paid by those who have the capacity to pay, right? And so I think the question is one not only of intergenerational issues, but intragenerational issues. We have sovereign states who are making progress, right? And if the need be, so the rich countries can make the transfers necessary to protect the Amazon today, right? As Germany is doing right now, as Norway is doing right now, right? And a lot of what is being done right now has to do with other countries trying to help, not discussing the sovereign rights of Brazil, but helping Brazil. And just to finalize, there is a lot of concern about local governance, right? If local government is appropriate or it's not appropriate to deal with those questions. There are many trade-offs, right? Energy, it's clean energy, but it's in the Amazon, it's the environment, it's the indigenous peoples, and so on and so forth. But we don't have the similar type of participation of those countries in the global governance, right? So there's a question of discussing in the global forum, right, precisely what should be done or what could be done, rather than discussing this in the World Bank, for example, where the representation of the developing economies is so much smaller than that of the today developed economies. So it's a broad response, but I think it's one of shared responsibility. But those who are going to enact the actions that need to be enacted should be who today represent the country as the entities in charge of their own development.
I agree that there is a sense of historical responsibility that is usually not addressed. I mean, the process of colonialism, there is a legacy and there is a different sense of responsibility that needs to be addressed. I will agree with that, and there are some groups advocating for some mechanism, like a reparation fund or the condonation of debt. I mean, there are many possible ways to find a way to have this, how would I call it, some way of historical reparation or shared responsibility, because there was a benefit for centuries. There was a benefit from colonialism. So, but okay, I like that. I will agree with that. But the other, I still think there is important to equalize the field. Still now, indigenous peoples are not considered to be sovereign groups. And I think there is a need to transform the state from this nation state that has a tendency to assimilate and homogenize population. It's not recognizing difference. It's not recognizing indigenous people as subjects with rights. And that's still, there are a lot of paternalism, a lot of racism. And that's why I think it's very important, the three mechanisms that you address to protect indigenous rights. So, well, there are changes that need to be done at the global level to address inequalities. I think there are also reforms to be done at the national level. And basically in the structure of the state, in the nature of the state, to give indigenous people equal rights. Because they don't have equal status right now. They are like second-class citizens. When people talk about Brazilian, they usually think about the non-indigenous. They don't think about the indigenous. So there is a need to, some people say, well, if we give them autonomy, then they will separate. And what they really want is to be recognized as citizens of Brazil with a different, as they are. If they want to develop, it's their right. And that's something that still is not recognized. Okay, I want to stop there.
Can I just jump in? So when we study Brazil in our course, we have a course called The Rise of Brazil. We have a section on what's called the racial democracy. And that Brazil is actually, as a nation, based on the mixing of indigenous, black, and European populations. And I wonder if you think that what has been done in the case of the black population, which is the introduction of affirmative action policies, will that be a way that it's viable in this in the indigenous case?
Well, I have a lot of colleagues who are doing research in Brazil on issues of race, and they complain that there is still a lot of racial discrimination despite the affirmative action. I'm not a Brazilian, so honestly I cannot speak with authority about that. But I think there is still a difference. I think Brazil has done enormous progress in addressing inequalities, putting in place very responsible social programs, but there is a difference in the way they treat indigenous people. And the counter-reform is like dismantling of the constitution. It's very clear how the process of land demarcation has been slowed down, and it's really reversing. So the progress made by the constitution is very disfavored right now, the situation for land rights for indigenous people.
Well, I would defer to my friend who's a lawyer on the question of sovereignty. But I think Dean Maggie's question begins and ends with the question of sovereignty. Brazilians have for years talked about a cobiça internacional, what's the word in English? The desire to take over of international forces of the Amazon, particularly amongst military circles, has been a long problem that from time to time erupts in the Brazilian press. And if we question Brazil's sovereignty because of its inability to manage properly a precious biome like the Brazilian Amazon, well, where does it stop? We live in America, and obviously we consume far too much in America, given our population. Maybe we too should be under international control so that we don't consume as much and pollute as much. The graphs that you provided, Professor, show that we disproportionately consume and pollute. Maybe we too should be under international control and relinquish our sovereignty to get the world back in balance. And then maybe the Brazilians would listen to us.
I would just like to pick up on the intergenerational equity point, because I think it touches on all these issues fairly nicely. And to speak to the scenario, that is a kind of dilemma that is presented fairly commonly, so I take that to heart. I do think that human rights law provides us the beginning of the answer, which is to say that absent the actual following of the safeguards that are outlined under law, that whatever option is taken by the president at that point, if those safeguards aren't followed, then the action would be illegal. So we should start from the premise that those actions are off the board and see what we are left with and try to solve the dilemma after that. And what does that leave you with? I think that actually leaves you with a whole lot. It leaves you with, it pushes in the direction of intergenerational equity on issues of colonialism and other historic discriminations. There are some affirmative action laws in Brazil already contemplate indigenous people. But it also pushes in the direction of intergenerational equity on the environment and also innovation and new types of solutions to issues that cannot any longer sustain being tackled with old solutions. So old solutions that depend on displacing 20,000 people and submerging large sections of rainforests without following the regular safeguards won't actually even be good for the economy in the long run, I would argue, because what the globe needs now is new ways forward that are sustainable in all senses and compliant with human rights law.
So if the president of Brazil had a student at Brandeis, and was a parent of a Brandeis student, would be able to reach out to the Brandeis community. And one of the nice things about the Brandeis community is that not only do we have some exceptional students, but we have some very well-respected parents. And so we're fortunate that in the audience, we have one of the parents, and Daniel Pfeffer, and I'm going to ask him to say a few words, because Dilma is still waiting for some advice, by the way. And Daniel Pfeffer is a member of the executive board and corporate deputy chief executive officer of a major company in Brazil, Suzano Holdings, but he's also president of the Instituto Ecofuturo and a member of the Council of Economic and Social Development. And so he can give a little bit of perspective from the business side and also business engagement in these important areas. So I put you on the spot, and I'm going to hand you the microphone.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Obviously, like everyone. Just want to maybe a few words to add some ideas that I think would be useful. That about 13% of the area, whole area of Brazil, it's already demarcated. That's 22% of Amazon. In 95%, this is completely demarcated. So I believe there is a lot to be done between government, entrepreneurship, and NGOs, working on the triple bottom line when I speak as sustainability. And what Lula did that was wonderful was to include about 30 million of the Brazilian, almost 200 million, in our society. They live below any dignity level of life, and now they're included in the social, economical, and political life. And this inclusion has a cost, which I humbly try to call it the cost for inclusion of society, because the government today, the political party that is leader today, they're learning. So the community has to pay time for their knowledge, for their experience. So at the same time they're consuming more, consumption increase. There are people that were excluded, now they're in government, they're in social, economic, and production. So we have to wait and see this development. And the indigenous community, it's part of this inclusion. So, like many other Brazilians, they used to live the informal, not legal ways to survive. And what the corporations and government and NGOs could do is to bring them to formality, to develop a professional career, to learn how to conserve their indigenous areas. And NGOs like TNC, the Nature Conservancy, are doing this in Brazil, and many others. As ourselves, Ecofuturo is part of Suzano Group, a forest-based company, where we manage an ecological park and we develop a service. So anyone can hire our service to conserve their area, a farm, private or public farm, ecological park, with our expertise. So this is a form of cooperation. I like the debate, very delicate issue of the anthropologist views on indigenous definition. And it reminds me of a saying of a wonderful book. It's called Healthy at 100. And this book mentioned something like make me inspire thinking of your saying, Moses. It's like this. When money speaks, the truth is silent. Why is that? Because the whole informal activity of the indigenous communities involves money also. It's difficult to prove, but they sell wood, native wood, they sell rights to use the land. So this can be and will be and it is being changed. And I think a cooperation between government, planning, again, corporations with their NGOs, can do a lot for them. So I think we're in the right way. Thank you.
So before I open up to the audience, I don't know if there were anybody in the panel who wanted to ask one of their colleagues on the panel a controversial and provocative question. Otherwise, we'll let the students start to speak. So I'll give you a chance if you wanted to ask each other a question. Otherwise, we're going to let the students ask the provocative questions.
Can you give it a shot again?
Okay.
All right. Now, what really comes to mind, and I think it's different from the affirmative action that you asked about, is the fact that the way I see it, and when I might be misrepresenting it, one of the key issues is that the indigenous people don't want to integrate, and we don't want to have them integrated, right? In the sense that they want to stay in the lands that they have owned for I don't know how many years, right? So to assure that they have a place in the University of São Paulo won't help much. I mean, this is not their issue, right? And the question then becomes, how exactly do we preserve them, to give them equal rights, equal legal rights, right? In a democratic society where 198 million people will vote against preserving their lands, won't help either. So the question is, what is the legal status that would protect them? And at the same time, not being totally paternalistic, right? We don't want to treat them as minors, as in the pre-constitutional times, but at the same time, right, they're different in the way that their idea is that they have their own way of life, right? And they want to preserve that. They don't want to integrate. They don't want to become, as far as I understand, they don't want to become as the Western white type of Brazilians that the other, I don't know, 195, 97 million are. So I think it adds a layer of complication, right, that goes beyond the issues that have to do with the environment and so on and so forth. Is how do we protect them, listen to them, and at the same time deal with those problems, right, that have to do with the interface between the rest of Brazil and the indigenous community. So I don't know exactly how to tackle that.
Can I just make a quick point? I'm sorry. Which do I have to hit? Can you hear? Okay. 3 out of 8 indigenous people already live in the cities in Brazil. So that suggests that they are well on their way to assimilation. That would be about 300,000 out of 800,000. Further, there are all sorts of indigenous people in the countryside that are in the mahogany business, are in the land rights business, in the water rights business already. So what I would suggest is that this is a researchable question, really. It's something that we should look into. Obviously, there are some that want to live forever and ever as what we call today foragers, but in the old days were called hunters and gatherers. But that is rendered impossible because their hunting grounds and forage has been diminished. So they don't really have a choice in the matter. They're being forced to assimilate. Now, and we could argue that, well, they're like Don Quixote tipping at windmills. Well, they've been surrounded. My own family lived with hunter-gatherers in the Chavanti Indians in the 1950s in central Brazil, and they would trek for months all over the central plains of South America. And they were in great physical shape. Their teeth were perfect. And now they're surrounded by the world's second largest soybean complex. And their lands are demarcated, but most of them are invaded by soybean and small farmers and so on and so forth. They're eating the Brazilian diet. Now their teeth are falling out. And all kinds of things have happened to their culture as a result of this. So all I'm saying is, I think one has to be careful when one says they just want to live that way. I think it's a researchable question. It needs to be researched.
Just a two-handed maybe before you...
Can I? You really raise that issue because you can see our desire to react.
We got excited.
Yes. So I think that they don't want to assimilate. That doesn't mean they don't want to integrate. What they want is the right to decide in what terms to integrate, and if they want to remain as gatherers, if they want to have a community development, whatever they want, that's their right. And that's what they're fighting for. Now, they are diverse. Some have been assimilated because the condition for them has been very negative since colonial time. So the fact that some have assimilated or some have more acculturated, to use the word, we don't have any right to judge. They are who they are, and they want to remain different, and they want to have the right to have self-determination and have a say in the future, and the future is in the Amazon, and they have a right to have a political representation and have a process to be part of Brazil, but in their own terms. So I don't want to romanticize that they are all the primitive, good savage, but I don't think that they are all assimilated, and I don't think it's inexorable. And I think we should support the resistance, because they have resisted. In the case of Brazil, going to the north, to the east. In other cases like Peru, in the middle of the colonial encounter, there are multiple forms of resistance. And what is amazing is that after 500 years, they still are very clear who they are and who they want to be. And I think if Brazil is a democracy, like most countries are, we have to grant the rights to decide their own future, and to see them as stakeholders, to see them as partners, and people who have the say.
Yeah, I just want to say something about, I did some research on the Piaroa from Venezuela at the time that tourism was starting in their lands. And apparently what happened in their case, that, you know, when it was a they, we tended to generalize too much. And even within the Piaroa, half of them supported ecotourism. They said, you know, this is the future and we have to engage in it. And half of them said, no way that I'll have strangers walking on my sacred sites. So the question that I have is, like, you know, how can you account for that? And I think, you know, within the Piaroa, with the Piaroa, there was this mentality of, you know, to have a relationship with the other, it is necessary. So it's not that people don't want to relate, but the other is also dangerous. And then the terms of the engagement is what will be important. And, you know, in my talk, I think what I try to say is that there is a role for, you know, in the form of relationship that people have with indigenous people has to be made more complex, because sometimes it's viewed as a very simplistic way, but it can't be too complex to the point that, you know, you can't really understand what people are saying anymore. So I think we would need to find kind of middle ground there.
Thanks. No, I think, yeah, maybe I generalized, and as a lay person on the issue, I think I did. But I think the issue Dr. Spinoza raised, I think it's crucial, is the distinction between integration and assimilation. How can you guarantee that and make sure that the teeth don't fall, right? I mean, as they get surrounded by the white people, get engaged in the business that is being created there. How can we assure that, right? Participation, integration without assimilation, and what's really the meaning of assimilation? How much do they participate in what I call Brazilian society, the rest of Brazilian society? So I think there is a trade-off, there are several trade-offs. It is very complicated, and I think the notion that one should, to some extent, support them in their fight, I think is one that I agree with. The question is how to make this operational, right? There's a new issue of Revista Piauí, which is like a New York Review of Books of Brazil, with an interview with Raoni last week, which is very interesting. And the question is that we don't want to integrate. So there are questions in Xingu, the whole question of Belo Monte. How many of those 20,000 want to integrate? There's now a new project being discussed in Tapajós, right? Which is even worse. There's more people, right? It's more complicated, and they say they don't want to integrate. How far do we go? How exactly do we listen to them? How do we incorporate that? I'm not contesting this, but I'm just raising how complicated it is.
I think part of my point is that are we really understanding what they're saying when they're saying we don't want to integrate? Yeah. You know, that goes to that level. Are we really understanding?
Want to get that. All right, we're going to have one more, and then we're going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, and on this, just a very interesting question you raised about operationalizing protection and tension between a kind of respect for autonomy and paternalism on the other side. I would agree that there can be a tension, actually, but just to add one more fact, that indigenous groups who have been suffering incursions, which are almost all of them, are incredibly, typically, very politically active, perhaps in non-traditional ways, but I mentioned, for instance, the protests. So there is a lot of agency and self-determination going on, and that's what the consultation paradigm of human rights law is ultimately about, I would say, which is not to totally resolve your question, but just to say that that's part of why it makes sense to write the rules as so protective to begin with, because there are so many ways in which everything else pushes against that respect.